The Seattle Kraken get a win in their final preseason game. What does that mean for the upcoming regular season under Dan Bylsma? Hold on.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what do you say, Seattle hockey fans? Welcome to another episode of Locked On Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we bring you your favorite team, the Seattle Kraken, every single day. I'm your host, Erica L. Ayala, and as we are now doing, starting just this season, Zam Beg from Davy Jones' locker room is going to be joining us on Thursdays. Zam, how are you?
I'm doing great, Erica. Preseason is finally over, and now the next time the Kraken play hockey, it's actually going to matter.
I know. So excited. The real deal, the Disco Dan era is about to start, and the first game is at Climate Pledge Arena, an afternoon matinee at that. So that's going to be exciting, and a full slate of NHL games next week. But before we get into that, Zam, I want to let our listeners and viewers know that today's episode of Locked On Kraken, once again brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Now, you know FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. You can place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. So visit FanDuel.com to get started. And where we're going to get started, Zam, is with a recap of this win over the Edmonton Oilers. We know they went the distance with the Florida Panthers last season in the Stanley Cup final. Of course, this is preseason of the next year. Very different. That being said, let's talk Insular first. Given that this was the last preseason game, what were some of the things that you saw in this preseason game as compared to their first preseason game against Calgary?
So the most important thing was this was as close to what we would realistically see in a regular season game when the games matter. The only reason why we didn't see what we would like to is because of injuries. So Jared McCann and Ty Cartier both missed due to injuries, and so there was some line shuffling there. But where it's possible to put the players where Dan Bylsma seems like he wants the players to be, the lines made sense. The defensive pairings were what we thought defensive pairings would be. And this was clearly, this is what, I mean, they're lining up the lineup like you would a regular NHL game. And that was true for both sides.
Yeah, for sure. It was definitely something that stood out. Two things that you mentioned. One, Ty Cartier. We'd been hearing from Dan Bylsma in the days leading up to this game that Ty Cartier was on maintenance, and obviously it was something that was still a little bit nagging. Also, something that we heard obviously on the broadcast, and then that Dan Bylsma talked about after the game, was Jared McCann. Now, Zam, you know you were there at CPA, but McCann took or he was a part of warm-ups, pregame warm-ups on the ice at Climate Pledge Arena, but did not factor into and was not slated in for the game yesterday. What do we know about that right now?
It was a weird situation because Jared McCann did go out for warm-ups, and on the NHL media site, it has the lineups. And Allison Ballard, who was sitting next to me, noticed that the lineup had changed real time, and Jared McCann had been removed and John Hayden had been inserted. And then we realized that McCann wasn't on the ice anymore. So I don't know if something happened in warmups. I don't know if it was like Jared McCann was going to go out and test something and says, okay, I'm not feeling good enough here. It's a preseason game, so it doesn't matter that much. But it was weird because you don't usually see that where they go out for warmups and then they leave, and seeing it happen, you know, I don't recall the lineup ever changing in the middle of warmups. That's really unusual. So when it asked about it, Coach Bylsma said he's day-to-day with the lower body injury. What does that mean? Who knows? We don't know what Bylsma's coach speak means yet. So we're still trying to decipher the code. But we're probably not going to know much until the next time they practice.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously that's a huge blow. Jared McCann has really led the offense for the last, handful of seasons here. We know that he has also suffered from injuries in the past that have kept him out of the lineup. And, it's a significantly different roster, I think it's fair to say, without Jared McCann. At least that's been the case in years prior. McCann was the first player that the Kraken offered an extension to. So I think it goes without saying that this is a player that we expect to be a huge part of the Kraken moving forward throughout his most recent contract. But, that notwithstanding, the Seattle Kraken did get the win, and we really saw the offense open up again against an Edmonton team, the most likely, the most NHL-ready roster that we've seen from them, certainly in our games against them in the preseason. So what stood out to you that made the offense kind of sing, Zam, and get 6 goals, put up a 6 spot in that game Wednesday night?
Yeah, so both teams did get to as close to an NHL roster as they could. And the Kraken, they were getting to the front of the net. They're much more aggressive. And so one of the ways that they're generating offense is turning defense into offense, going in the corners, getting puck retrievals, and then quickly getting it through and going the other way. And you have facilitators like Brandon Montour and Chandler Stevenson, who now you're starting to see, the vision of how these people fit in because they can use their speed and creativity. And Shane Wright. And then also even John Hayden taking advantage of that, taking advantage of the space created by good skating, fast skating, and having this aggressive mindset. And it just opened up things. And then the Kraken, they got chance after chance, and then they scored a lot. And none of them were on the power play. So these are all 5-on-5 goals.
I think that we definitely saw a lot more continuity when it came to the offense. And that is something that we've seen the Kraken struggle with. I know that I've been very critical of the Kraken in preseason because there have been seasons where we've seen them play very aggressive on the forecheck in preseason, and then that did not translate, unfortunately, aka last season, into the regular season. I really think the last 2 years, quite honestly, I think it was the year before I liked their forecheck in preseason, and then that didn't translate. And then last year was just kind of a train wreck right off the hop. I know Allison Ballard did some data pulling on that. And again, it's preseason, I think. And I talked about this on yesterday's episode, Zane, you and I have talked about it. I think Dan Bylsma was very experimental and strategically experimental in this preseason. And the more I was thinking about it after yesterday's episode, I kind of like it for a few different reasons. In particular, that he's keeping the players on their toes, but then also there's still, even from a scouting perspective, for, let's look ahead to St. Louis, right? That's the next game. I don't know that, given that the Seattle Kraken have a new head coach and they have that in their pocket, but now throwing multiple looks, I don't know that. I'll say it this way, and I'm no hockey coach or GM, but I'm not confident that I know exactly. There's definitely concepts of a plan. There's more than concepts of a plan. There's definitely more than concepts of a plan, but it's also, it seems to be a fluid plan. And I think for me, that's also a way of future proofing. And to your point, we saw a little bit of that last night, right? Jared McCann down. Ty Cartier can't go after, needing a few maintenance days. Next player up. And I think that really rung true with a player like Brandon Tanev, who not only did we see bump up to that first line, but got on the score sheet pretty early for the Kraken.
Got on the score sheet early, tipped in a Riker Evans shot, and then there was really some drama in the third period. He blocked a shot with his ankle, and he had trouble getting off the ice, and then he went down the tunnel, and it looked bad. I was thinking maybe it could be a broken ankle, and then less than 5 minutes, I see the number 3 out there, and I'm like, well, Will Borgen doesn't skate that well, and I was like, that's Brandon Tanev, but how he was? I mean, I think it was 4 minutes apart, and then he assisted. He had a beautiful primary assist on the 6th goal of the night. I believe there's so many, they run together on Will Borgen's goal. And so he was a big contributor. He has, I think, more enthusiasm and juice to his game this year, and it's showing up. And it was just so nice because it was so scary seeing him go down like that. And then he just sort of come right back up, and he looked fine. And he's just Brandon Tanev. I'm
really glad you brought up Brandon Tanev, because he's been someone that in the offseason I've talked a lot about, because you wondered if there was even a role for Tanev in how he was implemented under Dave Hakstol. And I've also talked about, if what I think I know about Dan Bylsma is true, it almost seems like a Tanev type player could fit in really well to what Bylsma is trying to do. And so proof positive in that final preseason game, like we talked about, him stepping up into that role gives him an opportunity. And coming up later on the show, Zam, we're actually going to talk about, did Tanev need this game and this opportunity on that top line? But before we get to that, I talked a lot about the power play, and it was one of the things I absolutely wanted to see if the Kraken could improve upon. Spoiler alert, I'm not sure that they really did. What were your thoughts on the power play in Wednesday night's game, but then overall from what we've seen from preseason?
The power play did not look great last night, but overall I thought the power play had looked better in previous games. They're implementing a new system involving a lot more player movement, and you're starting to see that. For whatever reason, the execution wasn't there. There was one of the power plays that the Kraken iced the puck on their own power play, which is just humiliating. But I wasn't really concerned that much about the result. I would be concerned if they weren't adopting a good process. And they went to 0 for 4, which is, I mean, that's not absurd. League average is around like 20%. So, it's not an outlandishly low number. And I haven't looked at the numbers for the entire preseason because I don't think they're very predictive, because the personnel is not going to be on the NHL roster. So there's still a lot of unknown here because we don't have a large sample size with the full NHL roster. But they're moving the puck. They're getting they're doing the things that they want to do, is to be dynamic. The execution will be good or not good depending on the game, but the system is there and you can see what they're trying to do. And I think it is a better system than what they've been doing in years past.
Yes. And you and I kind of talked about that last time we were on the show. We had a lot of our YouTube faithfuls in particular really reacting and responding to some of that breakdown. And you also got me thinking a little bit more, and I've been saying this in the YouTube comments, about maybe some of the things that really irked me about Dave Hakstol that maybe are indicative of what not only we might see, but why Dan Bylsma was the choice to come in and get this Kraken roster on track. So coming up next, we're going to talk about what we think the final cuts are. And then we also have some stock up, stock down again. So Zam, I'm going to throw some stock up, stock downs at you, see what you got cooking. All right, we're going to talk about that coming up on today's episode of Locked On Kraken. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And we know, obviously, this is a Seattle Kraken podcast, so we're talking NHL odds. We know that we did our roundtable and the over-under for wins for the Seattle Kraken over at FanDuel, 87.5. I got to ask you, Zam, you taking the over or you taking the under on
that? My knee-jerk reaction is probably over.
That's basically what I said. Yes, over, and I want to see how it goes. But you can find those type of bets over at FanDuel. And FanDuel right now, especially if you are an NFL fan, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. You can, if you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same exact page where you're going to make your bets. And speaking of those bets, you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. So are you going over or under on the Seattle Kraken at 87.5 wins? Let us know. And of course, you can do that over at FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com. Check out the futures bets, check out the NHL bets, or the NFL bets, and all that jazz. As always, we ask you to make your choices responsibly. Thanks, as always, for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. Erica L. Ayala here with Zam Beg, and we just talked about the final preseason game, which of course leads us to have a conversation about what the final roster is going to look like, Zam, before the team takes the ice for the ones that count. And we got some news just today before we started recording.
Yeah, so Cale Fleury has been sent down to Coachella Valley, and I assume he will clear waivers. So now the Kraken are down to 23 players. The problem is, as is with their 23-man roster, they are going to be $1.2 or $1.6 million over the cap. They have until the start of the season to figure this out. But as is right now, with their 23 players remaining, this is not a legal NHL roster that they can play on. Let's try this again. As is, this is not a legal NHL roster that can be played in the regular season. It can be in the preseason, but the cap gets turned on for the regular season only, and that is a problem. And so the sword of Damocles is hanging over Ron Francis, or really the players. Some people are going to have to be moved, or something has to happen.
Yeah, and that is the conversation that obviously we are going to have on the show for the next few episodes, because that is the big question. And that's why I really love, Zam, that you talked a little bit already about Brandon Tanev, because from my estimation, just coming into training camp, I think there were a lot of rumors, there were a lot of conversations on Brandon Tanev, maybe even a Yanni Gourde. And, I'm curious to get your thoughts now, knowing that there are some things that the Kraken need to do to be compliant. Do you think there is a chance that Dan Bylsma and company, I guess Ronnie Francis also and co, will opt to take some young blood and maybe make a move for a veteran like Yanni Gourde or Tanev? That's been some of the conversation. Or do you think we really just kind of lean down the roster and send some of the young blood down to Coachella Valley to start the season?
I think that it depends a lot on the injury situation. If McCann or Cartier really aren't ready to go, then that really forces Ron Francis's hand, because you don't have. So first of all, with 23 players, That can't work. So one of two things needs to happen. Either they trade a veteran like Brandon Tanev or Yanni Gourde, or they send 2 players down to Coachella Valley, and those would be some combination of Josh Mahura, Ryan Winterton, and John Hayden. I would guess not Mahura because he's the 7th defenseman, and they don't really have a good 8th defenseman. Cale Fleury would be that person, but he really struggled in the preseason. So they could go with 21 players and send down Winterton and Hayden. But if there's an injury, then now you're down to 20 players. If something happens during warm-up, or if they're on a road trip and they can't get somebody up from Coachella Valley the same day, it's not realistic. And so something has to happen.
Yeah, well, I'm curious, and I was just going to ask, where are you leaning? What are your thoughts?
I think, given that we've already had injuries, I think that probably Brandon Tanev does get traded before the season started, and he is the player that makes the most sense to move based on role and salary. Makes $3.5 million. That would free up plenty of room, and you could slide John Hayden right in that slot and provide a lot of the same grit and pestness and sandpaper and standing up for your teammates that Brandon Tanev brought at a much cheaper price. And then they have flexibility to now operate an NHL roster properly.
And so what do you see as the trade value? Because again, this has been something we've grappled with in the off season on the podcast. You make a trade and it seems like with everything that you laid out, it's not really a like for like trade because you still have to worry about salary.
Yeah. I don't know. This one's a really tricky one because there's a ton of precedent for this kind of situation with the current salary cap climate. The Kraken may need to throw in a little sweetener. So Brandon Tanev and I don't know, like a 3rd round pick for a 5th round pick back, something like that. That may happen, or they could retain some of the salary, but given that this is trying to clear up salary cap room, that doesn't really make a ton of sense. So it's a really tough spot to be in for Ron Francis because people around the league know that this has to happen and reduces your leverage considerably. And there aren't that many teams that have the cap room to take on a $3.5 million winger this close to the season.
Yeah, it's a really tough thing. And again, I alluded to it earlier, but some of the things we've been talking about in the off season is just like, there's also the body of work, right? What is the value? So you're talking about just timeline, and that impacts what the real time value is. And that's where we have to be considerate of how we're talking about the people attached to the trade moves and the business moves, right? Because some of it is timing, right? If you make a trade at a good time, it can determine the winners versus the losers, or if you kind of get a mutually beneficial situation. But this now is the Seattle Kraken up against it. Tanev had a good showing. I do think he needed that, whether he stays with the Kraken or not. I think he needed that because I think he got lost in the sauce. And that's not something you want to be saying for a team that everyone agrees struggled last season. So I think it's going to be really interesting. Before we move on to our stock up, stock down, there have been murmurings of the captaincy. What is the latest we've heard from Disco Dan?
Disco Dan was asked last night if they will have a captain by Tuesday, and he said, quote, "We will see." Ron Francis, during one of the broadcasts, said that they thought that they would have a captain by the start of the season. So he hinted at that. I don't know what the exact quote was because I'm pretty sure it was a home game, so I didn't catch the broadcast.
Yeah.
But I saw people reacting to it on Twitter. And But so it sounds like they're going to have a captain, and as to who it is, it could be one of 3 or 4 different people, and we'll just see.
Yeah, and Mike Benton, had a tweet out just kind of outlining the players that we've seen wear letters this preseason, and it's pretty much the usual suspects, more or less. So I'm very curious. I've always said that I really like Eberle. I know a lot of people have concerns with his contract and his age, but for me, he's head and shoulders one of the most vocal and kind of lead by example kind of leaders that we've seen on the Seattle Kraken. But I guess we'll find out, or we won't, because that's what we know.
You're not required to have a captain, so.
Yeah, well, yeah, who knows that better than the Seattle Kraken? So TBD on that, but when we come back, we're going to get into our stock up, stock down with Zam. All right, thanks again for joining us here on Locked On Kraken. If you have some time, go check out Locked On NHL. Tuesday is when our Locked On NHL show does the Pacific Division Roundup, and then every other Friday, I join Rachel and Gil to do the Women's Hockey Spotlight, which will be tomorrow, Friday. If you're not listening to this the day this episode goes live, it will be Friday. We're going to talk about the PWHL. They are going to have mini camps, and we will also talk about the rivalry series rosters. But let's wrap up this episode of Locked On Kraken with our stock up, stock down. Now, some of these we've talked about in previous iterations of stock up, stock down. It's basically, do we think this player or this individual or this topic is on the rise, or is it starting to flatline? So, we got to talk about it. Preseason's over, right? The grace period, the honeymoon, whatever you want to say, it's over. Now, Dan Bylsma's playing for the real deal. So at this point in time, we just finished the last preseason game, Zane. Is Dan Bylsma, in your estimation, stock up or stock down?
Oh, stock up, definitely. People are excited. The team is fast. The players seem rejuvenated. The offense has so much more juice to it. There seems to be more cohesion, more dynamic offense and movement. This is so much fun, and I think the team is considerably better. They have better players as well, but also they just, I think that Dan has really lit a spark under everybody, and they are ready to go. As Philip Grubauer said last night, it's go time.
Let's do it. I'm so pumped up. Cannot wait to check out that first game. Should be in Seattle for that one. I'm on the road right now, but we'll see. I should be able to make it to school on time, as the song goes. But all right, stock up, stock down on. We're going to do this as a twofer. The new kids on the block, in Chandler Stevenson, I should say the new champions on the block, Chandler Stevenson and Brandon Montour. Stock up or stock down?
Stock up, and you started to see why the Kraken were so interested. They manifest in different ways, but we're creating offense. Montour creating space with his unbelievable skating. Last night, he had a goal that John Hayden found him, but he had so much space on one side, and he had time to wind up for a 80s style Al McGinnis slap shot that trickled through the goaltender. But that was created by his way to move in ways that no Kraken skater has. He is just really, really incredible. And then Chandler Stevenson, his creativity and his vision are really the things that kind of stood out to me. There was a power play goal where he had a crosslock pass to Eli Tolvanen. This was in one of the road games recently. And it was through traffic, and it was not a pass that people would would really try or want to attempt, because it was such a high degree of difficulty. And Andre Burakovsky had talked about how he is able to make these kinds of decisions because his mind is always quiet. And so he just has kind of a different hockey brain, and he sees things really quickly and execute on it. And you start to see that creativity. It's really, really neat to see both of them, very different ways of contributing. Well, Chandler Stevens, he's also fast, but you're starting to see the pieces. Oh, this is how they can fit in. Sometimes you sign a free agent, you're like, okay, but where's the vision? Is this a good player in a bad fit? These are good players in a good fit.
I love what you're talking about here. You and I have talked about Brandon Montour and the skating ability. Someone else who really stood out to me, especially on the edge work, I think Ryan Winterton just had some maneuvers that he was able to get out of trouble and really see the ice a little bit better with how he was able to maneuver on the ice. And to your point, you were talking about Montour, but respectfully, we haven't really seen much of that. Just kind of like elite level, very smart and effective, efficient skating throughout this Seattle Kraken roster. So I'm super excited for that. I love what you're saying about Chandler Stevenson, especially that nugget about Andre Burakovsky, because I think you may have been on an episode, or you and I have talked about it, but I certainly have begun to question if putting the injuries on the shelf if part of the reason that we were not able to unlock Burakovsky for the Kraken is because he wasn't on a line and we never could find that right fit for him when it came to him being able to just fully trust in the other two skaters that he had so that his creativity flows freely. And so the fact that that's something coming from Burakovsky and that we've seen that already in Chandler Stevenson. My big bad, I don't know if it's a big bad bold prediction, but you can put it on tape. Some of you probably don't know what that means. You can put it on tape that I think that if we see Stevenson and Burakovsky continue to work together, that is going to elevate Burakovsky's game in a way that we just have not seen for the Kraken, because we've seen it with his national team. We obviously have seen how he plays in the NHL. So I love that. I also love what you say about Stevenson, because it also brings another level to the center position that, again, we have not seen, I would argue, in Kraken history. And so we do have a final stock up, stock down. I have this as Shane Wright, but I think I'm going to add on actually Matty Beniers as well. These are two young centermen. We saw that Pierre-Edouard Bellemare took a lot of time with Matty Beniers on the face-off dot last year. But of course, Pierre-Edouard Bellemare, not as far as on the ice product at the same caliber as a Chandler Stevenson. But so the stock up, stock down is, where are you with Wright and Beniers right now? And how, I keep adding things on your list here, Zam, but how, if at all, do you think Stevenson can be a healthy influence for what the Kraken are trying to do, not just on his line up the middle, but throughout?
So Wright and Beniers, as far as stock goes, so with Matty, I think he looks more confident. He looks better. He still doesn't pop off the way that he did the very, very first time I saw Matty play. It was against New Jersey at Climate Pledge. It was his first home game, and it was just so clear that he was so talented and maybe one of the 2 or 3 most talented players on the ice, and it just really popped. I'm not seeing that as much. We didn't see that last year, and so he's progressing. I think he's getting better. So I'm stock up on Matty. With Shane Wright, here's what I want you to do. I want you to call your broker. I want you to liquidate all of your assets. And I want you to put everything you have on Shane Wright. Sell the mortgage, sell the farm, sell a kidney. Shane Wright is unbelievable. Last night, he was so good. He's been so good the entire preseason. It's not just the goals, but last night he had just an unbelievable spinning backhand net front goal, and it was just like instant. His hockey IQ, his brain, and the way he processes is so fast, and it manifests in all these little different ways. Like when there's the puck and the two closest players to the puck are Shane Wright and a player from the opposing team, he gets to the puck faster than the other player, even when he has more distance to cover, because he recognizes that quarter second, just a little sooner, of what's happening. And it just, that little edge just lets him beat players out to pucks, and then he can set up plays. Like, yes, he's going to make some mistakes, but you can see that what he wants to do, his brain just lets him do it. Where sometimes, like Matty, it's like you can kind of see like what he's trying to do, but the brain and the body don't quite line up. With Shane, that doesn't really seem to happen. And then the other thing is his shot. When he was drafted, his shot was good, but he kind of pushed it. He needed to redevelop his shot mechanics, which is very, very common. Now, but he had his second goal last night was a laser. It was harnessing the full kinetic chain, driving with the legs through, and using your body as kind of a slingshot, and with all of that force going right into that puck. And it was breathtaking. He is so good at the little things. He's so good at the big things. And he's so detailed. He works so hard. He is, and his draft pedigree matches what we see here, right? He was a presumptive number one overall pick for a couple of years, and then bizarrely fell to number 4. But this guy looks like what a number 1 overall pick would look like when he gets to the NHL. Bye.
So just so I'm clear, I just want to make sure I have it. So you are most definitely stock up on Shane Wright.
Yes.
I freaking love it. We have already talked about this, you and I think we mentioned it on our very first podcast together, but we are definitely going to lean into your expertise when it comes to Shane Wright, because, I think there's so many storylines coming into this regular season. Shane Wright is definitely one of them, and I think he will continually be one of them. And listen, we didn't even get to goaltending, which I kind of love, because for the last 3 seasons, I've been pulling out my hair, not literally, because that's not fun, but it's like, okay, what are we going to do? How's this going to work? I think there are still questions that we can ask about goaltending, including who are we going to see in net, which Dan Bylsma has already told us we're getting no more of that. So I guess we have to ask Mike Benton for the rest of that. That's an inside joke for the scrum. If you know, not to be Jennifer Lopez about it, but but we're not going to get that from Dan. It doesn't sound like. So we're just going to have to watch the games to figure it out. Or, of course, you can head over to Davy Jones' locker room and listen to us here on Locked On Kraken, and we'll give you what we know. But as always, Zam, thank you so much for turning up on a Thursday with me to talk about the Seattle Kraken.
I love it. I look forward to it every week.
Well, we are looking forward to this season, and this season starts next week. Handful of news that we can pretty much expect coming up in the next few days, and we will have you covered between the Seattle Kraken beat. I've said this before, and now that you're here, Zam, I just really want to give you some stick taps. I know you and I have had these conversations before, but you and your staff, and quite honestly, from my experience, the entire Kraken beat, like, we are the lucky ones. We have a really good group of people. I feel like everyone is super supportive, and so I'm so grateful to have you along this journey with me here on Locked On Kraken.
Well, that means so much to me, Erica. Like, I really admired you before I ever met you, and that means a lot.
Well, hey, we got to help each other out, my friend, and we get all the good stuff out of the way now so that we can spar and spat and no one thinks we hate each other.
Right.
All right, for Zam Beg, I'm Erica L. Ayala. This, of course, has been Locked On Kraken. We close, as we always do, reminding you, be kind to yourselves. That should open up space for you to also be kind to others. And it's the real deal now, baby. Hope you're warmed up. Get those lungs ready because we're going to hold fast. We're going to stay true, and loud and proud we say, let's go Kraken. We'll catch you on the next episode. Peace out, everybody.